All right. Thank you. This is Lynn Weddle, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I know this has been a monthly event, hoping we are producing content that's relevant to you guys. I wanted to give you a little background. I'm one of the partners here, and I spend a lot of time with customers, with prospects, really talking about managed service. And this thought came from a conversation where I told the customer during the course of the project that they're asking me all the wrong questions. So it was kind of funny, kind of interesting, and really my thought was to arm you guys with topics and conversations that are relative to the experience that you guys are going to have, allow you to get a little deeper to make sure you get a handle on the partner you pick and what it's going to look like and feel like as you go down that path. So thank you. I'll navigate you through this webinar, and feel free to ask questions. Justin's going to shoot this out afterwards, so we'll make it fairly interactive, and here we go. Quick high level on Redleg. A lot of folks know us, but for the few that are not familiar with Redleg, we are a security services company. You'll see the 3 lines of business on the right, anything from advisory, that's your strategic services. So virtual CISO, gap assessments, risk registers, really anybody trying to build a program, execute a strategy. Our assessment services, those are all of our folks testing networks and applications, whether it's web, mobile, SCADA, you name it, it's a fairly full stack team. We are a Chicago-based or Chicago suburb-based company, 2008 veteran owned. I'm the Redleg, I'm the artillery guy. So we love the veterans. Here's the cast of characters that's going to be talking on the call. My picture's horrible, but I'm better looking in person. That's me, Lynn Weddle, one of the founding partners. Michael Smith on the call is our senior manager over our technology services group. He really works with customers on the client-facing side to help craft solutions and work through the projects. JD Bacon manages our internal team responsible for our threat intelligence and our incident response offerings. Here's kind of the agenda. We're going to get into typical questions, better questions, Q&A. And I'll pause for a second. I wanted to sum up really where we spend a lot of time with customers that haven't worked with a managed security services company. We get, and this is a short list, questions around 24/7, questions around SLA, sizing, the differentiation type questions. What we feel, those are important questions and they're definitely relevant for the project. What we don't spend a lot of time doing is digging into a lot of the security specific questions or questions that are going to really guide the engagement. So I wanted to put this together to highlight some of those and arm you guys with a better list of questions. All right. What are your core skill sets as a service provider? This one's important. What we see right now in the space with security service providers is everybody's trying to be one. And what I mean by that is we get folks, whether they're a data center company, whether they're a networking company, a telco provider, those really is what their core values are. You know, Redleg as a company, we've been doing security since 2008, and that's kind of our pedigree. And that's legacies. Everything's born and bred. Everything that we do starts with security. So from offerings that we build to customers we're working with. For providers out there that have different pedigrees, if they're, you know, selling you a disk, installing switch route, those folks probably have a diluted focus. So getting into what is their core skill set will help you guys at least have a handle on what you can expect. JD, you know, I'm going to throw this over to you. What do you look for in a provider as it pertains to kind of a core skill set?
I mean, you sort of already touched on it. Basically, one of the most important things for a managed security services provider, in my opinion, in terms of a skill set, is experience in security. What's the background of the employees? What's your training structure like as a team? You know, what are your requirements? Your senior staff members, what do they look like? You know, I'm going to be on LinkedIn checking out their profiles, seeing what kind of certs they have, if they have any, how long they've been in the industry, previous jobs they've held. You know, just gauging in general, are they truly a security centric shop, or is this, you know, as you said, are these a bunch of IT people who worked on firewalls in the past and now they're trying to deliver, you know, managed SIEM services or manage my IDS or et cetera.
And JD, if you get a hold of, you know, if it's a company that doesn't have a, you know, a background in managed SIEM and there's an incident, what are some of the fallouts of not understanding the capabilities of the skill sets of that provider?
So that's one that we've seen more than a couple times. It gets risky if you have a customer who's got a managed SIEM and they don't really understand what's capable of it, and now you've got an incident on your hands. You know, we get into a situation where we're trying to triage an incident and we don't have the log sources in the SIEM that would really empower us to tell the full story of how the incident took place, answering those key questions of who, what, when, you know, how and where did the incident occur. You know, everyone's going to put their firewall logs into their SIEM, and that's pretty standard procedure. But do you have DNS logs? Do you have anything that has HTTP header logs in them that's being logged to your SIEM? Do you have the appropriate Windows logging configuration so that we're getting, you know, security logs? Are you logging PowerShell logs from Windows logging infrastructure? So all of those questions are really important. All of those points are important to be able to truly scope an incident. And if with customers who are either managing it on their own without much experience, or service providers who don't have a ton of experience, they're not guiding you in a direction that's really going to empower you to be able to tell that story when that time comes.
That's good. And I'm sure there's also some synergies with incident handling, right? If you get into an incident and maybe you're taking advice from that provider as it pertains to, you know, re-imaging a system or things like that.
Oh, absolutely. You'll end up actually destroying forensic evidence. And depending upon how that incident turns out, you know, if in the onset of that incident, and we see this time and time again as well, is it appears to be just a malware outbreak at some point. And then as we dig deeper, or while we're still trying to triage that malware outbreak, now we've uncovered, oh, there's actually a lot more going on here, but we've told them to, you know, re-image these 20 hosts, and now we've destroyed a bunch of forensic evidence. And depending upon the scope of that outbreak or that incident, you know, you could actually be liable for destroyed information.
So it's fair to say that complementary skill sets are important as it pertains to
Absolutely.
Q&A. Yeah. All right.
So you're just laying the groundwork for, you know, being able to guide the relationship and the customer into a better security posture, and for the customer to be prepared for the inevitable, essentially, whether it's a malware outbreak or it's a full-blown breach or incident.
No, good feedback. All right. Question 2 is really around content creation. What content is, and JD, keep me honest, content in the form of security, SIEM, are rules mapped to use cases that alarm that analysts investigate. And having the right mix of content built by the right people is a fairly important, crucial task. So, JD, speak to content a touch. Out of box rules versus stuff we're building with specific use cases. What are we seeing from our customer base?
Absolutely. So, there are certain out of the box rules that pertain to security infrastructure, which you're always going to want to use. Your AV or your EDR tool marks something as malware. You want that to translate into an alarm within your SIEM. Now, that's great when you're alarming off of security infrastructure that you're leveraging the alarming capabilities of the security infrastructure you've invested in, and those rules out of the box should absolutely exist. Now, in terms of out of the box SIEM rules, every SIEM, regardless of which platform you're using, has tons and tons of logic-based rules that you can apply if you have certain log sources. And what we see time and time again, either with inexperienced service providers or a team that may be lacking some experience, is they're going and they're just enabling rules because they think that sounds appropriate. They see a rule that says ransomware, so they turn it on. They see a rule that says Trojan, so they turn it on. And that approach is actually, it can be harmful at some points because that ransomware rule may be dependent upon certain log sources, for endpoint activity that you're actually not even logging into your SIEM. So in reality, that rule's never going to fire. But what that is actually doing is, since that rule is enabled, it's holding the pieces of logs that you do have in your SIEM in memory, waiting for that other data that's never going to show up. So you're utilizing, and you're essentially doing harm to yourself by utilizing memory, CPU cycles, etc., within your SIEM for enabling rules that are out of the box rules without really digging into their logic and verifying log sources, etc. And you're going to hurt your ability to potentially ingest all and parse all of your log sources, or for other rules to be functioning properly. And that's really just one piece of it. And you get into the other piece of it, which is very many people think that rule packages are set it and forget it. That is absolutely not the case. You can't enable, even if you've verified the log sources and you verified the logic, when you stand your SIEM up, in 2017, and you think, all right, I'm good to go. Now I just make sure it doesn't fall down and I should be good. I'm covered. If the attack landscape is changing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, we can't count on those rules that we enabled in 2017 when we stood up our SIEM to keep us protected. They're going to be missing things as things evolve constantly. So your rule package is something that you absolutely have to be constantly refining, constantly reviewing, making sure that it is up to date with whatever the TTPs are that are actually being leveraged in live attacks.
And JD, I probably once a month, I would say, I get approached by a customer or a prospect where they have a certain number in mind, and they will go, I want 120 rules on my SIEM, or I want 85 rules on my SIEM. It doesn't work like that, does it?
Not at all. Not at all. No, I'm a firm believer in the fewer, well-written, well-purposed, well-tuned rules is more effective than 85 or 100 rules that you're not really looking at, you're not tuning, you're getting false positives that are firing so often you've overwhelmed, your SOC to the point where they're not even responding to half of the rules that are firing. Absolutely less is more, not only in the CLI, but also in terms of rules for your SIEM.
No, good point. And kind of goes back to, from our perspective, make sure that, these are great questions. The provider that you guys are going to should be able to address them. They should have process methodology for this, if they've got, if they've got that pedigree. All right. My next question, it's really focused around digging into the engineers. I know in a lot of cases, I would say probably as a security practitioner, my biggest pet peeve is, everybody when it comes to security is just like a person, right? If I look at a data center practice, I got, a storage admin, a network admin, I've got a help desk, right? There's different disciplines under the data center. With security, I often feel like sometimes we all get looped into one individual role, and people look at security as just a position where it's multiple different hats. And for us, we like to dig into the different hats that are going to be touching our account, assigned to our account that we'll have available. JD, what type of engineer is ideal for a managed SIEM? Like, what would you expect if you were a consumer coming to a managed service provider?
So, I would be looking for, I want my point of contact to be a senior level, architect level or senior level engineer who has years of experience with whatever my SIEM platform is. That's what I would be looking for. I want someone who's going to be able to, do all the custom stuff that I need them to do, whether it's dashboards or parsing, which I know we'll get into that later. But I want someone who, can give me the same level of support on a day-to-day basis that I can get through 2 or 3 tiers of escalation for the vendors, vendor support channels, or people who are able to answer questions even beyond some of those vendor support level questions, unless you get that, the guru guy who's sitting in the vendor SOC or whatever. And that's what I'm looking for.
And so what does it look like then on the client side of like from a position perspective? Are you, what do you want in the analysts that are touching the accounts, that are doing the alarm investigations? How are those roles different, right? Is that a different mind? Is that a different skill set?
There's definitely overlap. Some people have both of those skill sets. Some people can wear both those hats. That number of people is far fewer than are frequently forced into that position. Some people are great engineers. Some people are great security analysts. Very few people are very good at both. They absolutely exist. I would like to fancy myself one, though Lynn may disagree with me. But they absolutely are different skill trees. And the only way you can build out both is from, a decade plus of experience within the industry. So the analysts that I'm looking for, that I want triaging, my alarms on a daily basis, my security events on a daily basis, I want people who are involved in the cutting edge security attacks as they're evolving, people who know all of the most recent vulnerabilities that have been released, people who are cutting their teeth on malware every day, not people who are troubleshooting, database write errors or writing custom parsing rules, or, I want people who are focused on security, who live and breathe their lives in security and what's happening from currently in the security landscape.
And I think, folks, from here is you can kind of see this is a conversation, right? So when it gets into, exploring the service offering from providers, take a few minutes, dig into some of the folks that you're going to be working with, talk to some of the folks that you would be working with, make sure you have a handle on the folks that will be part of your engagement.
There's a couple great questions that you can ask, when you're sitting down with a potential service provider. You can ask some really great questions like, what's your analysis methodology? If they've got someone who's doing their security analysis on that call with you, they're going to be able to give you a really great answer in how they approach any security investigation. Similarly, in that same conversation, ask a question about their approach to log ingestion, an engineering focused question, or how they provide custom parsing. Gauge whether or not the same person is answering that question. If the same person is answering that question, go look that person up on LinkedIn. Maybe that person is one of those few people who's been in the industry for 10 years or so, and they actually can do both of those things. But if it's somebody who has been in the industry for 3 years and they're a junior person, they're answering both those questions. They're very likely reading from a script, or they're telling you what you want to hear more than they're really able to back up what they're saying.
No, great point. Moving on, question 4. Now we've got a SIEM, deployed, and what's next? A lot of our conversations are very focused on the now. With SIEM's a platform, and outside of the now, we see very few folks really looking at kind of that future path. And for us, it's really important because at some point you will need additional skill sets from your provider. Maybe not year 1, maybe not year 2, but somewhere down the road, you guys are going to look at the SOAR, the buzzword around orchestration and automation, parsing as pertains to new use cases or log sources, or intelligence. And I'll throw this question right back to JD. JD, what would be some of the things you would care about as a practitioner getting into a contract with a service provider? Once you've got the SIEM stood up, what would you expect from that provider?
So it's all about evolving that security practice, and that security posture, right? Too often do we see people stand a SIEM up and they think their work is done. I would argue once you stand a SIEM up, your work really just starts. You now have the ability to see the things and aggregate them into one location. Now you start, looking at things like, well, how do we make our tools work together? And that's when, we go down the SOAR road. What does the API look like for these tools that we're leveraging? Can we get them to function together to maximize our efficiency and our workflow on a day-to-day basis, whether that's with a provider or without a provider? What are our niche log sources that are specific to our business? Do we have an e-store or a web application that's customer facing that we can get some technology owners on the phone and figure out, hey, what's normal behavior of this web application? Let's look at these database logs, and what's a deviation from standard behavior within this custom application? Let's figure out how to develop some use cases and write some custom alarm rules or dashboards around that application, and not just focus exclusively on, security logs or firewall logs or your standard AV logs, your standard security stuff. You got to start evolving and thinking out of the box in order to really take your practice to that next level where you're actually putting to work the stuff that you've stood up.
I like it. Thank you. All right. This is a good one. We touched on it briefly around methodologies for investigations. What we get from the customers right now, the prospects right now, they'll dig into SLAs around doing the investigations. And for the most part, I would say 9 out of 10 of them, that's where the conversation stops. Where the customer, at the end of the day, whatever that provider is doing, they're going to be judged on what they send back in their investigations. So why not spend some time digging into the methodologies, understanding what the expectation is from that provider back to you. JD, can you talk over, methodologies? Why are they important? as pertains to investigations? Are they different from alarm type to alarm type?
Absolutely. And yeah, they do differ from alarm type to alarm type. So you should be asking the questions like, you know, who's in charge of building out your use cases or your rule package or your analysis methodologies? And the answer should be, you know, some form of senior team or some specialist group of individuals who have a lot of experience, you know, whether that's an incident response background or a threat intelligence or a threat research background, you know, who are able to dissect the most recent, most current, most often used tactics, techniques, and procedures and turn those into effective rules. You know, you want to hear answers like, you know, we use a framework. We look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and we develop use cases from that, or we enable rules from that rule package. You know, you want to hear things like, well, we're reviewing vulnerabilities every Patch Tuesday, and we're writing use cases and assigning severities to the vulnerabilities that are released. And once we have severities and use cases, we're writing rules around them. The investigation process and methodology, you want people who, you know, again, that same group of minds, the experienced incident responders, threat researchers that know how to answer, know where to look, and know how to answer those who, what, why, where, and when questions that should be answered really with every analysis. You see so many providers who they just throw an alarm back over the fence, right? You know, your IDS fires for an outbound communication to a potentially malicious site. So that alarm fires, your provider fields that alarm and says, hey, customer, I'm escalating this to you because your IDS fired and said you had a potentially outbound communication or an outbound communication to a potentially malicious site. Gee whiz, thanks, provider. That's exactly what my IDS sent to you. All you did was throw that back over to me. Why don't I just modify the responder in my IDS to be myself because you provided me no value? You know, it should be every alarm that comes through, there should be an attempt to answer those questions. And that process is going to be built, and how to come to those answers is going to be built by the people who have experience answering those questions.
I like it. Moving on, question 6, offerings that really complement SIEM. I know we touched a little bit on incident response, things that surround a SIEM, offerings that you would be, you know, potentially relying on. I know threat intel is always a big topic with our SIEM customers at some point. I know it's a very, you know, it's a big space. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And JD, in the context of SIEM specific, what's the user experience, you know, with and without threat intelligence? Why would a customer want to know whether or not a provider has the capability of offering threat intel?
Well, there's a couple things I have to say about that. Firstly, your SIEM doesn't know what's evil. Your SIEM is a place to aggregate all of your security relevant logs and then write rules that look for behaviors across multiple of those aggregated log sources. And that's how you alarm from a SIEM. What threat intel empowers the SIEM to do is to say, SIEM, when you see any logs come into you that have, you know, that are communicating or contain these pieces of data from known bad actors, trigger an alarm. And that's essentially how you empower a SIEM with threat intel. You know, you can write behavioral based rules in a SIEM to look for, if I see call outs this many times to a website or an IP address followed by, you know, large data transfers, then that's an exfiltration rule. If I see multiple authentication failures followed by authentication success, you know, those are all behavioral based rule logics. What you're doing when you're importing a threat intel feed into the SIEM is you're saying, these are known bad pieces of information. If you see communication with any of them, whether it's a domain, a URI, an IP address, or a file hash, we know that these things are bad. Please tell me about them. So you're just, you're empowering the SIEM with who the bad guys are. Now, once you bring threat intel into a SIEM, it's really important, and very many SIEMs have the ability to enable open source feeds or vendor provided feeds that don't cost any money. I would challenge, or if anybody has experience with doing that, gauging that false positive ratio from subscription based premium feeds to your open source feeds, because that becomes a whole job in itself to dig through that volume of false positives. And in general, I'll say this to a service provider, it kind of speaks to the maturity of that service provider as a practice, if they're offering threat intel, if they have that research team, because that's going to tell you not only are they going to give me the intel that I need to empower my SIEM with who the evildoers are, they also have that team of people internally working to find out that information. And those people are also, backing other parts of that, analysis methodology or et cetera. That team existing within your provider tells you something extra about that provider besides just that they have a threat intel feed.
I like it. We already kind of touched on incident response. Those are good questions to ask. Does the partner have that capability? And let us know if we have questions or additional questions on that topic. All right. Oh, maybe this is a question. Really still following up on that point.
I don't think we had gotten to this one yet.
Yeah, I know. I like to read ahead. But no, I think we've got this one. So questions on forensics capabilities, preparedness. JD, I know we touched a little bit, but forensics capabilities, what's kind of bare minimum for you, right? When you're digging in, you're working with a partner, at a bare minimum, what questions should you be asking? What capabilities should they have?
So this is important as well. And this also speaks to kind of what I touched on with the threat intel stuff. It says something about the maturity of a provider if they also offer these services in-house, right? Now, I may be slightly biased, being that I work for a provider that also has IR services in-house, but I think I can confidently say, and other people from other providers would agree with me, when you have a provider who has, intimate knowledge of your landscape, your threat landscape, your, just your attack surface in general, and how your network is built, it speeds up that initial triage, that initial containment process. They already have an indication as to what your business critical services are, what we need to make sure stays up. It's just a lot faster in terms of being able to engage a partner who already has knowledge about your network, that when evil strikes, essentially. Having forensic capabilities, having the ability to do some of these exercises with someone you already have a relationship built with is just going to make it that much easier and that much more effective when an incident takes place. Now, it's never going to be easy when an incident takes place, but one of the most important things is how fast can we recover from this incident? How do we limit the amount of damage that this incident brought us? Someone who comes in and knows nothing about your landscape, it's going to take them longer to minimize the damage done and make sure that, regular business services are restored than it would someone who already knows what those services are. And
there's a big, there's from the incident response kind of timeline, there's a difference between doing kind of that tier 1, tier 2 investigation and the incident. There can be questions in between. And, I see a lot of cases where the client may or may not have the, folks on the internal team to address those questions. So there's stuff kind of pre-incident where you might have questions. So those capabilities may not be forensics in nature, are still senior security related.
Yeah, there's been very many instances where, someone like myself gets brought into a customer situation that may be, on the managed SIM side of the house, and they bring an IR specialist like myself or someone else on my team into a situation where there's questions. We see this Emotet outbreak. Was this the result of this phishing campaign, or is there more going on here? Is this do we need to engage incident response services? Do we need to take forensic images? Can you offer us a little guidance? And more often than not, that becomes just a conversation where guidance is offered, and we don't necessarily need to go down the road of full incident response. Maybe we take a couple forensic images, or maybe we can answer those questions more in depth with a senior IR person on the phone to, give them the warm fuzzies, let people know, hey, this is the remediation path you should be taking. This is a well-known commodity piece of malware. Looks like the outbreak started within this phishing campaign that we're aware of. These are the steps you need to take. We don't need to engage a full IR sort of response here.
And the biggest reason for this question and why this question is important, right? It might not be in direct support of the SIEM managed service you're looking for, but it probably has as much importance, because running an incident, if you've not been through one of them, that's fantastic. That's a good thing. If you have been involved in them, you understand the visibility. You've got typically the C-suite breathing down your back. Anything from the communication side, the security side, there is a high level of visibility to produce answers expeditiously on the spot. And to understand what you have or you don't have with that provider before you get onboarded with that provider is critical. So if you select a provider that doesn't have that capability, you need to make sure you can address that capability or communicate to the business that this provider doesn't have that capability. So these are just great questions to help outline a successful project. Closing thoughts and questions. I do see a question that popped up. So I'll wait for other questions to come in. JD, one person had a question around the frequency of reviewing the content package. Is there is it once a month, once a week? What does that look like to the average Joe?
So I sort of touched on this earlier. That's it. In my opinion, it needs to be reviewed weekly. I think weekly is a good, obviously attacks are changing daily, but a weekly review of the rule package, what's effective, what's not effective, what's our false positive ratio, what are we seeing across our customer landscape? Are these rules firing at all? Which ones are the noisy ones? How can we tune them? What are they firing on? Have any out-of-band vulnerabilities been released in the last week? That's our approach. I think that's a respectable approach. Monthly would probably also be a respectable approach. Reviewing that rule package after Patch Tuesday. Figuring out those use cases from anything we learned post Patch Tuesday. And that would also be a respectable approach. But someone who says, we're reviewing them yearly, or we don't have an organized approach to how we review our rule package, those are huge red flags. I think monthly or even more often, our approach is weekly. I think that is the way to go. That's the most effective way to go for minimizing false positives and maximizing effectiveness of the package.
Let's see. Any other questions?
Looks like we had another one pop up.
All right, what do we got?
From Bob. Want to speak briefly about MDR versus MSSP in SIEM. In both solutions, are they treated differently? So MDR versus MSSP. So managed security services provider, essentially MDR is a service that would be provided by an MSSP, right? So is managed SIEM. And I think probably, Bob, that's what you're getting to, is the differences between managed SIEM versus MDR, managed detection and response, which is really just managed EDR. Now, they're different, and they both absolutely have value. I know that there is a large trend in the space right now that people are devaluing a managed SIEM practice and sort of focusing now on MDR practice. Now, I love MDR. I think it's hyper important. There are so many questions that we have at the end of a traditional SIEM-based analysis, questions that revolve around the host and what actually took place on the host, that you can absolutely answer all those questions with an MDR service. Now, that does not devalue a managed SIEM service. We still absolutely have value in aggregating all of our logs in one place. We still absolutely have value in behavioral-based logic that comes across multiple log sources. We all absolutely have value in being able to empower threat intel with a SIEM. We absolutely have value in being able to leverage a SIEM in a incident or malware investigation. But MDR also has a huge amount of value, and it can't be understated. And I think they really both, have their place and can exist simultaneously. It's like saying, should I have firewall logs or should I have, security logs from my domain controller? Well, you shouldn't have one or the other. They're both great, and if you're going to do them in-house, you have your own team built out to manage your EDR tool independently and also manage your SIEM independently, then do that. If you need a provider because you don't have that sort of depth of team, or you need 24-hour or 24/7 services that you can't support internally, then do that. But when it comes to MDR, you're empowered to see what's happening on the host and potentially do some light level remediation. That's something you can't do with the SIEM. When it comes to the SIEM, you can't step back and look at, your firewall logs versus your DNS logs, all from a bird's eye view of your network. You're sort of honed in to that host level view. Now, very many EDR products allow you to do enterprise-wide searching, but you usually have to have a starting off point, right? You either have to have, you found one infected host, now you can look for that executable or service or DLL or whatever your initial piece of information is. You can then search laterally through your enterprise for that same piece of information. And you can even have some, heuristic behavioral-based rules in an EDR tool via an MDR service, but you lose that bird's eye view of your entire network and the ability to do any kind of custom log sources or custom alarming based on, niche applications. So I think they're both hyper valuable. They are not mutually exclusive.
Fair to say they complement each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope that answers your question, Bob.
All right, I like it. All right. I think that's a wrap, folks. So I hope we helped you. Two, I hope you can take this, help guide your experience if you're in the market for a provider. If you have questions, if you have clarifications, you've got our information, and we'd love to hear from you. Let us know if there's anything else out there you guys need help with. Again, I appreciate the time, the hour we took from you, and we'll talk to you next month. Take care.